February 26th, Monday. It's for a shoreline restoration project, specifically a solution to a failing seawall. We can provide the details for this webinar in the chat link. And yeah, feel free to search for that specific Great Lakes COP on LinkedIn as well. And we'll, if any of you are following us on LinkedIn, we'll provide the details as well after this meeting. So without further ado, Benji Eisenberg is a coastal adaptation design strategist, investigating how coastal adaptation can support First Nation food security and traditional ecological knowledge preservation. He's primarily working on integrating those strategies into Tsleil-Waututh Nation's shoreline adaptation and visualization project. Benji has spent time living and researching in Tibet, China, Japan, the Middle East, to better understand how ecological stewardship is being affected by climate change. Benji grew up on the ancestral Massachusetts Nation territory in the winding estuaries of coastal Massachusetts, USA, digging for clams and tapping sugar maples. And Benji's presentation is From Peak to Pelagic, a holistic approach to coastal adaptation, food sovereignty, and ecocultural restoration. So Benji, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, David. And thanks everyone for coming. I'm so excited to share with you something that is very important to me and near and dear to my heart. So I think, let's see, just getting it set up. Okay. All right. So can everyone see that? Okay.
Yep.
Great. Yeah, today I'm zooming in from the ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nation in so-called Vancouver, British Columbia. I'm very grateful to work, learn, play, and eat on this land and in these waters. And I would just like to pay respects to elders past, present, and future coming through this presentation and through some of the work that I do. And I'm very grateful to Becca and Jessica for asking me here, and for the Nature-Based Coastal Solutions Pacific chapter for hosting this awesome webinar. And at the very least, I hope it's some pretty pictures that are playing in the background of whatever delicious lunch you're having. I spend most of my time working with Tsleil-Waututh Nation on their shoreline adaptation and restoration project. And I also work at the University of British Columbia as a research associate in the Coastal Adaptation Lab, looking at the interface between ecologically beneficial coastal solutions and also coastal solutions that benefit culturally important knowledge. And that work is funded by the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. A little bit about me and my background. My family originally comes from Eastern Europe, and they came to North America, Turtle Island, in the mid-1900s. I come from a long line of bakers, and they started a bakery when they moved here in Lenape territory in what's now Brooklyn, New York. So food and displacement has been a very important part of my work and the legacy of my family. I grew up, as David mentioned, on the ancestral lands of the Wampanoag-speaking Massachusetts people in the Quinnipiquin River estuary in Shawmut, which we now call Boston, Massachusetts. And the intertidal has been a hugely important part of my life since I was a kid. I grew up fishing, grew up clamming, grew up eating pickleweed in the salt marshes. So when I'm wet and muddy and smell like low tide, that is when I am my happiest and when I feel my most beautiful. I also spent time working and learning in Southwest China and Northern and Central Japan, understanding how climate change and globalization are affecting ethnobotanical traditions and stewardship practices. And so I bring some of that knowledge with me to the work that I do today in British Columbia. And as a queer person, I'm very grateful to work in a space that I find to also be incredibly queer. You know, the intertidal in the coastal zone, it refuses to live in this binary of wet or dry, and I think that can cause some conflict with deciding how best to deal with these areas. But I really am inspired by an ecosystem that has its strength lying within the fact that it refuses to be one thing or the other. It kind of lives in this expansiveness, and that to me is endlessly inspiring. I finished my master's in landscape architecture at the University of British Columbia a couple of years ago, and since then I've really been focusing on how to recenter the designer as an active steward of lands and waters. So a lot of times projects will focus on aspects of infrastructure, but the idea of long-term maintenance and monitoring and stewardship are not always integrated. So whether it's planting wildflowers in a cemetery or trying to replant kelp in an ecosystem that has once seen it but no longer sees it today, I really am gravitated toward this more hands-on approach of taking care of the land and designing with intent for nurturing and stewardship. The coastal zone is something that I think we all may have slightly different definitions of. But for me, you might have guessed based on the title of this presentation that it starts in the Alpine and it ends somewhere in the deep ocean. And that's not just because I wanted to encompass ecosystems that I love deeply, but for me, it has a very specific cultural and ecological reasoning. The plant on the right you see, a cow parsnip, is one of the first to be recruited after a landslide or an avalanche, and its pollination relies almost exclusively on black flies, which need to lay their larvae in salmon carcasses that wash up on the shore or are on the banks of healthy rivers. So we need to have healthy shorelines in order to have healthy salmon, in order for black flies to lay their larvae, and in order for this plant to be pollinated and to physically stabilize the alpine. And on the left, the Pacific herring. I think a lot of us are familiar with the beautiful kind of milky, creamy blue water that the coastline turns in British Columbia every year when the herring come to spawn. But they live most of their life in the deep sea as pelagic species. So in order to make sure that the coastlines are happy, we also have to make sure that these species and species that rely on the coastline for important parts of their life cycle are also happy. And I find that spending time in these ecosystems is really what inspires me to do the work that I'm doing. And without building a relationship and an understanding of how these ecosystems function, I find it very difficult to then go back and look at how we can adapt with these ecosystems. And one practice that's very important for me has been free diving and physically immersing myself in these ecosystems in a way that we don't often get to see is very important to how I think about these spaces. So I'd like to take all of you on a free dive. So just enjoy for a moment. Okay, now everyone can breathe. I feel often we forget when we're watching being underwater. And not only do I like to be in these ecosystems, but I think being an active participant of these ecosystems is important to my practice. Harvesting and foraging is particularly important to me in my practice. Red rock crabs are voracious predators of native clam larvae and juvenile clams. And so in areas where there's a large amount of red rock crabs, harvesting or culling some of them can lessen the burden that these native juvenile clams have on trying to reach adulthood. And harvesting seaweeds at the right time of year can actually increase the health and growth of seaweeds and kelp long term. I'm unfortunately not the only one who likes to eat seaweeds and kelps. Urchins I think we've seen a lot of news around urchin barrens and the impacts of sea urchins on particularly kelp forests in the Pacific. So whenever I can, harvesting sea urchins in areas that are a little overburdened with them lessens the load that kelp has to carry in terms of growing very quickly and abundantly. And they taste delicious. And I do have a slight preference for red sea urchin, if you're wondering. Although purple and green are good, red tends to be the biggest and the sweetest, in my opinion. These stewardship practices that I am practicing could not be possible without the thousands of years of stewardship that has happened and continues to happen on this coastline. And for me, a lot of the work that I do comes down to how do we ensure that these stewardship practices that have such a deep and intricate understanding of coastal systems, both from an ecological perspective, but also from a sustaining human perspective, how do we make sure that they can continue to live on this coastline? And it's also difficult to just try and rebuild and reconstruct these indigenous and ancestral technologies because so much of what we know on the coastline and the coastal zone has changed because of the cascading effects of colonization and climate change. So understanding what are some emerging technologies that could support the indigenous ancestral technologies to make sure that both ecosystems and people can thrive for generations to come. So I'll take you through a little bit of my kind of thought process when I am approached with a site or a project that is trying to be taken care of or restored. So I go through these three kind of core steps, the three R's. They're not linear, but this is the order that they tend to take place in. First, there's reporting, then there's rebuilding, and there's restoring. And I put quotations around restoring because from the research that I've done and from communities that I've spoken with, and actually the writer Jessica Hernandez, who's Maya Cholti Zapotec, talks about this in her writing, that very few indigenous languages have a word for restoration, because when you're living in harmony and reciprocally and in equilibrium with an ecosystem, not much needs to be restored. But it's an approximation, and I think for now it does a good job. So with reporting, the two big questions that I first like to ask are, what are the ancestral relationships between people in this place? And what are the relationships like today between people in this place? So understanding what the ancestral relationships have been between people in this place, some really helpful tools for me are traditional use studies, visiting reference ecosystems, so ecosystems that are most closely related to what the site could have looked like pre-contact. And also looking at things like navigational charts, particularly with seaweeds and kelps. Old navigational charts used kelp as navigational tools. So understanding what a shoreline looked like even 100 years ago based on some of these colonial mapping techniques have been very helpful. And then in terms of understanding what the relationship looks like today, this is a big piece of this is just being on the site and being in that space as much as possible, talking to people who also have the deepest connection to that specific site and place. And this can happen through formal interviews or workshops, but it can also happen through asking someone to go on a walk or helping them in their garden or make dinner for an evening and just talking about how things have changed in their lifetime. And oftentimes in some of the work that I've done, I find that that's sort of where the work stops. There's a consolidation of knowledge and information, and that's great. That's important. I think it's good to keep layering the information we have on an area and how it's changed. But one step further that I like to take is through reconstruction. And this looks at kind of a more visual representation of some of those ideas. So what strategies can be implemented to strengthen the desired relationship between people and community, or, between community and the landscape or community and a specific site? And how do we pull from existing information like the navigational charts, like traditional use studies, like community workshops to visualize and spatialize some of these desires? This was a case study, a speculative case study that I did in my master's on an estuary in northern Vancouver Island that had been converted to an industrial log dump. And I wondered how some of the ancestral technologies layered with emerging technologies could be implemented in a site like this to foster a little bit more ecological diversity and resilience and potentially some culturally important activities. So I visited a reference site, which is the closest one was the Salmon River Estuary in Sayward, British Columbia, and I looked at how certain dendritic channels might have flowed in the site and looking at plant communities and eventually just using some kind of conventional 2D rendering could speculate what this area might have looked like and how ecosystems could be benefited just simply through qualitative visual understanding, and also how people might have activities that could take place here that continue to nourish this space. And as great as 2D renderings are, I find that 3D virtual reality renderings can also be very helpful. And I'm just realizing I didn't share audio. So I'm gonna unshare for a second and then share again with computer audio. Great. Okay. All right. So this is a little video that I made in my master's to help understand what some of these 3D virtual reality interventions might look like that integrate both ancestral and emerging stewardship practices. And there should be sound very shortly.
Stabilizing stream banks through planting deep-rooted berry shrubs like salmonberry and salal keep streams clean of sediment while providing the necessary shaded cold water for salmon eggs to hatch. As the water makes its way to the shore, it hits the marshy flats. The traditional knowledge of terracing and benching estuary vegetation expands habitat for the growth of important edible estuary root crops like silverweed, chocolate lily, and springbank clover, all while buffering from rising waters. Just beyond the marshes, like weirs in river mouths, sediment fences capture nearshore and offshore sediments, which build up the mudflats and act as a storm buffer, attenuating waves while increasing habitat for traditionally hunted shorebirds and rich sediment-loving clams like geoducks and horse clams. Stabilizing terrestrial sediments with structures influenced by traditional Pacific Northwest forest gardens allow for the shoreline to increase in biodiversity while providing fruits and vegetables for human consumption. This also retains terrestrial sediments and prevents further shoreline erosion. To increase protection to the nearshore, oyster reef balls mimic the complex structures of traditionally implemented intertidal stonefish traps, creating ideal habitat for oyster colonies while greatly reducing wave action to the shoreline. Similarly, integrating the tradition of shell midden mounding with habitat islands not only create wave breaks, but also allow for shell hash calcium to leach back into the nearshore sediments, thus promoting the calcification and growth of edible nutritious young bivalves, like blue mussels, Pacific oysters, and giant barnacles. First Nations throughout the coast have known for thousands of years that optimizing the 1 meter tide mark with walled beaches can increase quantity, size, and health of clams. These walled beaches also promote the growth of kelps and other edible sea vegetables. Pairing this technology with shoreline stabilization can protect high erosion zones and establish stepped ecosystems for sensitive marine species like eelgrass. Sediments can then build up and support an environment where clams purify the water column while eelgrass slows surface turbidity to increase clam growth. Influenced by the tradition of selective seaweed harvesting and transplanting, suspended kelp beds can allow for reseeding of once locally prolific kelp forests. These suspended kelp beds trap nearshore sediments, slow wave action, and sequester large amounts of both atmospheric and dissolved carbon dioxide. In addition to the kelp itself being an important traditional food, the forests also support habitat for culturally important spawning and juvenile fish, like herring and salmon.
So just one more thing on that piece. Those sort of speculative renders have been very helpful in starting conversation with community around what they might want to see, because the way that a lot of land-based stewardship practices are learned is experientially. So creating this virtual reality experience allows for a simulated sense of walking in a future landscape. And I find it can be a really helpful tool in sparking conversation. But after that piece is done, and that almost always in showing that to a community, there is just so much conversation around what used to be on the shoreline, and things that people would really like to see. So that's when restoring kind of comes in. And the way that I like to think about restoring is through the smallest scale possibles. The smallest scale possible through a pilot. That it's great to have these large infrastructural pieces, but oftentimes it's the smaller scale pilots that we can scale up to create long-term strategies for living with coastal change. So I like to think just off the bat, what pilots can be implemented to start testing and rebuilding the desired connection between a community and a landscape or a site? And how can these pilots, if scaled up, create change that's felt for generations to come, intergenerationally, and making sure that it's not kind of a one and done solution, but long term, this methodology can be felt in the landscape. So I'm going to talk about two case studies that I've worked on with Tsleil-Waututh Nation. The first one is forest gardens and a riparian restoration. The second one is sea gardens and bulk kelp stewardship. So with forest gardens, there's this sort of preconceived notion that that societies in the Pacific Northwest and cultures and communities were mostly hunter-gatherer, but there's a lot of evidence that maybe doesn't support that anymore. I think one of the examples that I really love is through beaked hazelnut, whose range is predominantly in southeastern and southern British Columbia, but in Hazelton, British Columbia, and you might be able to guess why it's called Hazelton, has a hugely dense population of beaked hazelnuts. And one of the studied potential reasons for this is because of the growing of hazelnuts that people have done there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So starting with this kind of tradition of forest gardens and terrestrial species vegetation stewardship, we applied that to a restoration program. And first, we wanted to understand what plants were on the shoreline. All plants are culturally significant, but I think to any of us that have done plant-based restoration work, some plants are much easier to transplant or propagate than others. So focusing on plants that have maybe more that have cultural use, but also ecological importance, high ecological importance, and sort of weighing both of those things to understand what makes the most sense both for the community and for the site. So in running the workshops, one of the main takeaways, it's not just to be producing plants, but it's also to be sharing knowledge around these plants and knowledge around propagating these plants. So yes, we're hoping to produce a large quantity of plants that can then be used for riparian restoration, but we also want to make sure that the knowledge of how to do that doesn't stop at a workshop, and that community members can go back to reserve or back to their house and find a similar plant and do a similar kind of restoration, so that it starts with the workshop, but it doesn't end with the workshop. And in terms of plant selection and numbers, we want to be harvesting plants that are as close to the site that we're hoping to restore as possible. And one really important teaching that I'm often reminded of is that the plants that are currently here on the site are the plants that are the descendants of the ones that the ancestors of this place took care of and ensured would be healthy and around for future generations. So in using the most locally sourced stock of plants is not only genetically advantageous, but it also ensures that the stewardship practices around these plants are respected as well as the plants themselves. And there are hundreds of plants growing today that we are intending to plant back onto the shoreline in the coming months and years of this project. So with bulk kelp is a plant that has been seen around Burrard Inlet and Tsleil-Waututh territory, but in recent years, in living memory, it has disappeared from the majority of the inlet. So this is something that came up because community was really interested in bringing the species back because it has such rich cultural and ecological significance. There's a long history of kelp stewardship and transplanting on the shoreline. One of the methods that we heard about was taking juvenile bull kelps and tying them to rocks and then sinking them off the side of canoes in places where there may have been kelp in the past, where the kelp forest is struggling, but just as a way to enrich an area that kelp wasn't doing so well. So first we collected the kelp reproductive material. It's called the sori, and that has to happen within 50 kilometers of restoration. Fortunately, there are still kelp beds in Burrard Inlet for reasons that are still being studied, but we luckily were able to selectively harvest, and doing this in a method like freediving, which is an important stewardship practice to this coastline. So being able to sort of like not only pair the restoration of this kelp project, but also the stewardship with an ancestral practice is important to this pilot. We then grew part of the kelp reproductive material in a lab and part of it on suspended lines. And the intent was to have the kelp get to about 0.5 meter to 1 meter on the lines, and then we could compare how that kelp did if tied to cobbles, how well that did compared to kelp that was just grown from the lab right on cobbles. The kelp that got tied onto cobbles ended up getting planted, and some of them ranged. By the time we harvested them, we put them on lines in November, and we harvested them in March. And the hope is that these sort of root-like structures, they're called holdfasts, they will bond to the cobbles, and the rubber bands, the 100% natural rubber bands will fall off, and so the kelps will have this substrate to hold on to. And I would say these are some of the smaller rocks, smaller cobbles. We found that larger cobbles made a little bit more sense, just because that float can carry a lot of weight, we learned. So we did some planting of the kelp, which was very fun. It's very satisfying to watch them sort of parachute down. But unfortunately, with this project, there wasn't a ton of, I would say, Western definitions of success, because a lot of the kelp didn't make it. But what we did learn is the range that is necessary for kelp to grow, because in other parts of the province, kelp can grow basically 5 times deeper than it can grow in and around Vancouver. So every step was about learning and about reconnecting people with a species. So although the habitat itself didn't necessarily get restored, I think the ideology that we were going with and the methodology behind restoring connection between people and species is just as important as connecting a species to an ecosystem. Some closing thoughts. First and foremost, if you can, get out in the ecosystem. Build your own relationship with the space that's important to you, or if you work primarily in the coastal zone, spend as much time as you can wet in the water. I feel like every time I go down to the water, I learn something totally new that I, without fail, will use in my work. And another piece is understanding how the past conditions, both ecological and cultural, are affecting the landscape that we're seeing today. And then ultimately understanding how that change can be sort of nurtured for future generations, and thinking on that 7-generation timeline, that what are we doing today that can be small, that can be scaled up in 7 generations to allow for food, materials, medicines to be available for generations to come. And yeah, at the end of the day, I mean, we live in a climate that is changing so quickly, and I think that there really isn't a silver bullet solution to adapting with climate change. Although I will say learning to live with change and learning to understand how a landscape can be nurtured through this change, I think is the closest solution or strategy we might have in living with climate change. So thank you so much. And I'd be happy to talk to anyone who's interested in this kind of work and support projects, and yeah, keep the conversation going. And if anyone's up for a free dive, I go every week, so just let me know. But thanks so much.
Thank you, Benji. Great presentation, and yeah, I'd open up the floor to questions. If anybody has anything, feel free to raise your hand or pop it in the chat. But maybe to get started, Benji, I would just ask, you mentioned about the kelp and how the environmental setting of Vancouver means that kelp growth and establishment is very different. Can you kind of explain what influences that? And then in terms of kelp resiliency to climate change with regard to like potential increased water temperatures, how is that going to affect the kelp forest locally as we project further into the century?
Those are great questions. I, unfortunately, am not a kelp scientist, but I will say some of the information we're learning specifically about Burrard Inlet is that, you know, kelp can grow up to 11 meters outside of the inlet, but it tends to grow in this 2 to 3 meter range. It could be because of light. It could be because of the way currents have changed. It could be salinity. I think there are so many factors that are yet to be determined, but they are underway. So stay tuned. But sorry, that's not a satisfying direct answer.
Okay. It's okay. Jake?
Hi, thank you, Benji. That was a fantastic talk. Really enjoyed it. My question as well is related to the kelp experiment that you did. And I was just wondering if you had surveyed the substrate before kind of choosing where to deploy it, and if you thought maybe, I don't know, if you placed the rocks or placed them within bigger boulders or something like that, you could have kind of changed the outcome of the experiments. Is that something that's been considered?
Totally. Yeah, I think substrate is hugely important. However, with some of the experiments that have been done on placing sort of matured kelps into substrate that isn't necessarily rocky, there has been success with it. This site in particular had sort of a mix of cobble and soft sediment. So that was the hope, is that it, the next generation could land on could land on cobble. But this site was primarily chosen because of oral histories or oral accounts from community that this is where kelp had been in the past. So yeah, substrate is definitely important. Depth is also very important, and current. So still a lot to learn.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
Austin?
Yeah, great presentation. I think a lot of people have questions about the kelp, but I had a question about the garden that you were building. I was curious whether because climate change and even like this year, the average temperature has gone up by 1.5 degrees, I think, so far. Did you ever consider including plants that weren't necessarily in past restoration, but could also support the same sorts of values that the ecocultural system had created?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We, I think, saw historic temperature lows and highs within a 2-week period. And the nursery where we're housing a lot of the plants is still pretty new. So we were worried what would come of them. We're hoping that because these plants have specifically been adapting to there's not really a scientific term other than like the wonky weather patterns that we've been experiencing over the past year. So we hope that they're somewhat adapted, but in terms of bringing in species that could provide similar culturally important, I guess, uses, I feel like that's something that could happen. It's not something I've done. And I think it'd be a great thing to ask community if that's what makes sense to them. But yeah.
Austin?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, the question from Enda Murphy, Benji. Very interesting presentation. Did you notice a difference in success of line-grown versus lab-grown kelp?
Yeah, there is some great research done on this that's coming out of Bamfield Marine Science Center. And then also Vital Kelp does a lot of kelp growing on lines. They're on the Sunshine Coast. I mean, again, not a kelp scientist, but the kelp that grows on a line is being subjected to an ecosystem that's very similar to where it will be outplanted. So just having that exposure at an earlier stage in its development, I have seen does a little bit better, but I think having a kelp scientist affirm that might be better. But yes, I think the earlier the kelp is exposed to where it's going to be long term, the better it will probably do. Thanks.
Robin, did you have a question?
Thanks, David. Thank you, Benji. A wonderful presentation. Really enjoyed it. The visualizations. You mentioned something about the stewardship practice and the importance of freediving in that context. And I just wondered if you would elaborate a bit on that. Is freediving something that the original Indigenous and community practiced?
To my knowledge, yes, that's what I've been told. I think some of the stories I've read around, particularly whale hunts, it's a very specific role, the person who dives in and has to tie the mouth of the whale. But even in terms of like bulk kelp harvesting, there's a practice of selectively harvesting the longest stipes, which I've learned is traditionally done through free diving. And yeah, coastal peoples, I think, learn to live with the coast, not just the dry parts around the world. So just based on what I've been told and what I've learned, that freediving is and being submerged in the water is pretty integral to a healthy coastline.
Fascinating and hardy without the benefit of dry suits and diving masks. And...
I'm weak. I'm 7-meter wetsuits all year round, so I can't. Yeah, I know people who do it without anything, and I'm
amazing.
Impressed.
Thank
yeah.
you. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. A related question for you, Benji, from Max from the DFO. Do you have any suggestions for getting into freediving for someone who has never free dove before?
Or depending on where you are, diving sports on Main Street and East-West Freedivers in Victoria. Diving sports is in Vancouver and East-West Freedivers. Those are the two like freediving shops. But I would say before you just like embark on trying to swim, you know, tens of meters below the surface, get a mask and a wetsuit and just swim around, and your life will be changed. I'm sure of it, especially if you work with this space. You will see it in a completely different way that I think, I mean, coming from my own personal experience, it's definitely changed the way that I see the work and how it can move forward. So yeah, grab a mask, cheap wetsuit, have an afternoon.
Very good. Any other questions, everybody? If you do think of something later, please feel free to reach out to ourselves and we can filter stuff through to Benji as well, of course. Maybe with that, we'll just wrap things up then, just to say thank you on behalf of the executive committee. If you have any other questions or suggestions about future webinars or what you'd like to see covered, please feel free to reach out to any of those on the screen here. We will be following up with a placeholder for the next couple of in the next couple of weeks with regard to a workshop, as I said, a multi-day workshop in October. And yeah, just wanted to say thank you again to Benji for sharing his time and his expertise and his experience. And yeah, have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Thanks so
Bye.
much.
Thank you.